Did you know that some fish can lay up to 2.5 million eggs in just one season? Yet most of these eggs fail to hatch and become mature fish. Many drift into waters too cold for hatching. And of those that do hatch, the vast majority are eaten by predators. The success rate is minuscule. It's only a tiny percentage which develop into adult fish. Now imagine if one day our fish started to think about things. All those failures, all that effort, and for what? Of course, if it decided it really wasn't worth the bother, no more eggs would mean no more fish. Over the years I've heard many people argue very much like my frustrated fish. Is it really worth doing something unless it brings a big success? Why do we bother christening babies? We never see the families again. Why do you bother struggling for justice and peace in the world? Nothing ever changes. Then there are those really annoying people who flaunt their great success and to make us feel much worse. Like the visitors I spoke to over coffee after one service. They casually mentioned, of course the church we normally go into London has over 600 members. And then to further rub salt in the wound, they continued, there's a church in New Zealand which has grown to over 6,000 worshippers in 10 years. It makes my ministry seems very inadequate. I've never grown a church to 600, let alone 6,000. So were all my efforts in vain? Were my little successes really failures? So I was greatly heartened by the story in today's Gospel. Jesus speaks of a farmer who had a series of failures. The seed that falls on the rock-hard path will never grow. The soil is much too compact. On this barren land, no seed can germinate. Vast quantities are eaten by the birds and other pests. The farmer may be providing well for the wildlife, but it's actually not doing a lot to produce a crop. Many young plants do actually germinate, but are still doomed because the soil is too shallow. It's merely a thin veneer over the bedrock, and without deep roots the young shoots will soon shrivel under the hot sun. And that's before I even mention the weeds which crowd out so many of the tender crop. The wheat is stifled by these more virulent plants. Yet another failure. It would be very easy for the farmer to conclude that with such a high failure rate, it really isn't worth the effort. Yet, despite these failures, he carries on, and in the end he does get a harvest. I wonder if this story was told to encourage those first followers of Jesus who became disheartened. Jesus himself was not always a great success. true, we hear today that there was such a great crowd that came to hear him that he had to retreat to a boat to make himself heard. But actually, a few verses later, which we didn't actually read today, Jesus bemoans that very few actually understood him. Indeed, the Gospels are full of people who reject him and turn away from him. Those large crowds would eventually turn on him and scream for his crucifixion. It must have been a great puzzle for those first disciples. In the translation from Romans that we heard today, the Apostle Paul boldly proclaims that in his Son, Jesus, God personally took on the human condition and entered into this disordered mess of struggling humanity in order to set it right once and for all. Well, if that's so, and Jesus is really God's love to become one with us, how come that he's denied and rejected by so many? Many of those first Christians expected a successful Messiah. And it's a common mistake often made today as well. And success is usually thought of in terms of numbers. Yet, in contrast, the message of today's gospel proclaims that we are called to be faithful, not successful. Faithful to Christ's message of love. Faithful in living and proclaiming the good news of hope. Faithful in first seeking God's kingdom of justice and peace. As long as we are faithful to God's will, we can leave success into his hands. So looking back at my ministry, when I was at Stoke Minster, we took seriously the command to share God's love in the city. Every Christmas and Easter we delivered thousands of invitation leaflets with a message of hope and encouragement. And it took a lot of hard work. The flyers had to be attractively designed. They had to be paid for. And probably the most difficult part, we had to persuade volunteers to go out and deliver them. Yet, as they dropped through the letterboxes, most of them went straight into the bin, unread. In secular terms, they were a failure. Just one or two hit home though. One young mum, let's call her Mandy, came to one of our services as the result of one such invitation. Some weeks later, she came again. After a year, Mandy was a regular member of our church and got confirmed. 3 years later, Mandy was our treasurer and parish administrator, a key person in the parish. In today's gospel, Jesus assures us, despite the failure of so many seeds, there is still a rich harvest. Despite the failure of so many eggs, there are still plenty of fish in the sea. Keep the faith. Don't be disheartened by your failures. Leave success to God. As St. Paul wrote in another one of his letters, know that in the Lord your labour is not in vain. Amen.